The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of Henderson's department store, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Most customers were either at work or picking up kids from school, making this the quietest time of day. Exactly why Margaret chose these moments to visit. She pushed through the heavy glass doors, her worn canvas bag clutched tightly to her chest. The bag contained everything she owned now: a change of clothes, a small blanket, some crackers she'd saved from breakfast at the shelter, and a photograph of her former life. The contrast between her appearance and the store's polished interior was stark. Her jacket had seen better days, her shoes were held together with tape, and her graying hair was pulled back with a rubber band she'd found on the street. But Margaret walked with purpose. She knew exactly where she was going. The furniture section. Sat in the back corner of the store, past the gleaming appliances and designer handbags. It was a quiet area where people came to test sofas and imagine their dream living rooms. And there, almost hidden behind a display of throw pillows, sat an old upright piano. The piano was beautiful once. You could see it in the rich mahogany wood and the intricate carvings along its base. But now, it was covered in a thin layer of dust, clearly more decoration than instrument. Price tags hung from various pieces of furniture around it, but the piano had no tag. It was just there, forgotten. Margaret approached it like she was greeting an old friend. She gently lifted the lid covering the keys and ran her fingers along them without pressing down. The black and white keys were slightly yellowed with age, but they were still perfectly aligned. She could tell this piano had stories to tell. Looking around to make sure she wasn't bothering anyone, Margaret quietly pulled out the small bench tucked underneath. The cushion was faded but still soft. She sat down and adjusted her position, her back straightening in a way that seemed to erase years from her appearance. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, as if asking permission. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost whisper quiet. She was testing the piano, feeling how each key responded to her touch. Some notes were slightly out of tune, but the piano had good bones. Her fingers found their way to a simple melody, something gentle and familiar. As she played, something magical happened. The tension in her shoulders melted away. The constant worry about where she'd sleep tonight, what she'd eat tomorrow, whether she'd be safe, all of it faded into the background. For these precious moments, she wasn't a homeless woman trying to survive on the streets. She was just Margaret, doing what she loved most in the world. A young mother pushing a stroller was the first to notice. She had been looking at cribs in the baby section when the music drifted over. The melody was so beautiful, so unexpected in a department store, that she found herself following the sound. She stopped at the edge of the furniture section, watching in amazement as this unlikely pianist brought the old instrument to life. The music grew more confident as Margaret's fingers remembered their training. She transitioned into a piece she'd taught hundreds of times, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was a piece that required not just technical skill, but deep emotional understanding. Every note had to be felt, not just played. More people began to gather. An elderly man who'd been shopping for a new recliner forgot all about furniture and found himself captivated by the performance. A teenager working part-time in the electronics department heard the music and quietly made her way over. During her break, even the janitor, who was supposed to be cleaning the restrooms, stood at the back of the growing crowd with his mop in hand. Margaret was lost in the music now. Her eyes were closed, and her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. This was who? She really was not the woman people saw sleeping on park benches or digging through trash cans for bottles to recycle. This was Margaret the music teacher, Margaret the performer, Margaret the woman who had once filled concert halls with this same magic. The small crowd watched in respectful silence. Some pulled out their phones not to mock or shame, but because they recognized they were witnessing something special. Here was raw talent performing in the most unexpected place, and it was more moving than any concert they'd paid good money to see. As Margaret played, memories flooded back. She remembered her first piano lesson at age 6, how her tiny fingers could barely stretch across the keys. She remembered her music teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. who had seen potential in a shy little girl and nurtured it with patience and kindness. She remembered the day she graduated from the music conservatory, how proud her parents had been. She remembered her first job teaching at Roosevelt Elementary, how the kids' faces would light up when she played for them. She remembered the diagnosis that changed everything, the medical bills that piled up faster than she could pay them, the insurance company that found ways to deny her claims, the choice between paying for treatment and paying rent, the eviction notice, the slow, painful slide from middle-class teacher to homeless woman. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, there was only the music. The crowd had grown too. About 15 people now. They formed a respectful semicircle around the piano, some sitting on nearby couches and chairs that were for sale. Nobody seemed to care that they were in the middle of a department store. They were all transported by the beauty of what they were hearing. A businessman in an expensive suit had stopped rushing to his next appointment and was standing perfectly still, his briefcase at his feet. The young mother was gently rocking her baby, who had fallen asleep to the soothing melody. The elderly man had tears in his eyes. The music reminded him of his late wife, who used to play piano every evening after dinner. Margaret opened her eyes for a moment and saw the faces. Around her, instead of the judgment and disgust she usually encountered, she saw wonder, appreciation, and respect. These people weren't seeing a homeless woman causing trouble. They were seeing an artist sharing her gift. This gave her the courage to play. Even more beautifully, her fingers danced across the keys with increased confidence, adding subtle flourishes and dynamic changes that showed her true skill level. This wasn't someone who had learned to play from YouTube videos or picked up a few songs by ear. This was someone who had dedicated her life to music, who understood it at the deepest level. The performance was becoming something none of them would ever forget. In a world where people rushed past each other without making eye contact, where everyone was too busy to notice beauty, this moment was different. A homeless woman and a forgotten piano had created something that stopped time and brought strangers together. But across the store, someone else had noticed the gathering crowd. Someone who wasn't pleased about what he was seeing. Someone who was about to change everything. Derek Morrison had been having a terrible day even before he noticed the crowd gathering in the furniture section. The district manager had called that morning to complain about last month's sales numbers. A customer had returned a damaged item and demanded a full refund, while screaming loud enough for half the store to hear. And now his afternoon coffee had gone cold while he dealt with a scheduling crisis in the electronics department. He was walking back from the break room, trying to calm his nerves, when he spotted something that made his blood pressure spike even higher. There was a crowd of people in his furniture section, and they were all looking at something. Derek's first thought was that someone had been injured, or that there was some kind of emergency. And as he got closer, he realized it was much worse than that. There was a homeless woman sitting at the display piano, actually playing it like she owned the place. People were watching her like this was some kind of free concert. Derek's face turned red with embarrassment and anger. This was exactly the kind of situation that could get him in serious trouble with corporate. Henderson's department store prided itself on being an upscale shopping destination. They sold designer clothes, expensive furniture, and luxury appliances to people who expected a certain level of class and sophistication. Having a vagrant performing in the middle of the store was absolutely unacceptable. He could already imagine the phone calls he'd get if this got out of hand. The district manager would want to know why he wasn't maintaining proper security. Corporate would question his judgment and leadership skills. Other customers might complain about feeling uncomfortable or unsafe. This woman needed to be removed immediately before the situation got any worse. Derek straightened his tie and put on his most authoritative expression as he marched toward the crowd. He was a man who took pride in running a tight ship, and this kind of chaos would not be tolerated on his watch. The fact that people were actually enjoying the performance only made him angrier. Couldn't they see that this was completely inappropriate? As he got closer, he could hear the music more clearly. He had to admit, grudgingly, that the woman could play. But that wasn't the point. Talent didn't give someone the right to trespass and use store property without permission. If everyone started thinking they could just walk in and treat the place like their personal playground, where would it end? The crowd was even larger than he'd initially thought. There had to be at least 20 people now, and some of them were recording with their phones. Derek's stomach twisted with worry. If videos of this started circulating online, it could be a public relations nightmare. He could already see the headlines. Department store allows homeless vagrant to perform concert. The board of directors would not be pleased. He pushed his way through the gathered customers, his voice cutting through the beautiful melody like a knife. "Excuse me, everyone. I need you all to step back, please. Ma'am, you need to stop playing and leave the store immediately." The music came to an abrupt halt. Margaret's hands froze over the keys, and she looked up with startled eyes. The spell that had been cast over the crowd was broken instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to fill the air like smoke. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She started to stand up from the bench, her movements careful and dignified despite the obvious humiliation she was feeling. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I was just ... The music helps me forget things for a while." But Derek wasn't interested in explanations or apologies. He was focused on damage control and getting this situation resolved as quickly as possible. "Ma'am, this is private property, not a public park or a concert hall. You can't just walk in here and use our merchandise like it belongs to you. This piano is worth thousands of dollars, and you don't have permission to touch it." Customers in the crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Few started to walk away, clearly not wanting to be part of whatever drama was unfolding. But others stayed, and Derek could see disapproval in their faces. That only made him more determined to handle this his way. "Look, I understand that you might be going through a hard time," Derek continued, his voice getting louder and more condescending with each word. "But that doesn't give you the right to come in here and disturb our paying customers. A business, not a charity. We have rules and standards that everyone needs to follow." Margaret's cheeks flushed with shame, but she kept her dignity intact. "I understand. I'll leave right now." "I really didn't mean to bother anyone." She gathered her worn canvas bag and started to move away from the piano, but Derek wasn't finished with his lecture. "And frankly," he said, his voice carrying across the entire section, "your appearance is not appropriate for this establishment. Our customers expect a certain level of, well, let's just say they expect to shop in a clean, professional environment. When people see someone like you in here, it makes them uncomfortable. It affects our reputation." The crowd's murmurs grew louder and more agitated. Several people were openly expressing their disgust at Derek's cruel words. The young mother with the stroller shook her head in disbelief. The elderly man who had been moved to tears by the music was now angry for entirely different reasons. "Completely uncalled for," said the businessman in the expensive suit. "She wasn't bothering anyone. She was sharing something beautiful with all of us." "Yeah, that was really harsh," added the teenager from electronics, who was supposed to be back at work but couldn't tear herself away from the unfolding drama. "She's just a person trying to get by. What's wrong with a little music?" Derek felt the situation slipping away from him, but he doubled down on his position. He couldn't appear weak or indecisive in front of all these people. "I don't need customers telling me how to manage my store. This woman is trespassing, and I have every right to ask her to leave. If she doesn't go voluntarily, I'll have security escort her out." Margaret had stopped moving toward the exit and was standing perfectly still, absorbing the public humiliation with a grace that made Derek's behavior look even worse by comparison. Tears were forming in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had been through too much to completely break down in front of all these strangers. "I used to be a music teacher," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "I taught children for 30 years. I never thought I'd be treated like this for just playing a song." Her words hung in the air like an accusation. Several people in the crowd looked genuinely angry now. Some were pulling out their phones again, but this time they weren't recording the music. They were documenting Derek's treatment of a vulnerable woman who had done nothing wrong except share her talent. Derek realized he was losing control of the narrative, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I don't care what you used to be. Right now, you're trespassing in my store, and I want you gone. Security," he called out, looking around for one of the store's guards. What Derek didn't notice was that someone else has been watching the entire confrontation from near the store's entrance. Someone who had seen Margaret's performance and Derek's cruel response. Someone whose presence would change everything that was about to happen next. Robert Chen had been standing near the store entrance for almost 10 minutes, completely captivated by what he was hearing. He had come to Henderson's department store for a simple reason: to pick up a birthday gift for his 12-year-old daughter. She'd been asking for a specific jewelry box she'd seen in their catalog, and he wanted to surprise her before her party tomorrow. But the moment he stepped through those glass doors, something extraordinary had stopped him in his tracks. Music was floating through the air, and it wasn't the usual background playlist that most stores used. This was real music, played by someone who truly understood every note. Robert knew good piano playing when he heard it. His own mother had insisted he take lessons as a child, and though he'd never become a professional musician, he developed a deep appreciation for classical music over the years. He could tell the difference between someone who had simply memorized a song and someone who felt every emotion the composer had intended. This performance was special. Whoever was playing had clearly studied music seriously, probably for many years. The technical skill was impressive, but more than that, there was soul in every note. Robert found himself walking slowly toward the sound, drawn by the beauty of what he was hearing. When he reached the furniture section and saw the scene before him, his heart nearly broke. There, at an old piano covered in dust, sat a woman who was clearly homeless. Her clothes were worn and patched, her hair was unkempt, and she looked like she hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. But the way she sat at that piano, the way her fingers moved across the keys with such grace and confidence, it was like watching a master at work. Robert recognized the piece immediately. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most challenging and beautiful pieces in the classical repertoire. Most amateur pianists couldn't even attempt it, let alone play it with such emotional depth. This woman wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She was telling a story with every phrase. The crowd that had gathered was clearly moved by the performance. Robert could see tears in some people's eyes, and everyone was listening with the kind of respectful silence you'd find in a concert hall. It was beautiful to witness strangers coming together, united by the power of music. But Robert's appreciation quickly turned to concern as he watched a man in a manager's name tag approach the scene with obvious anger on his face. Robert had been in enough business situations to recognize the look of someone who was about to make a very poor decision. He watched the confrontation unfold with growing dismay. The manager, Derek, according to his name tag, was treating this talented woman with shocking cruelty. Robert could see that the homeless woman was trying to be respectful and cooperative. But Derek seemed determined to humiliate her in front of everyone. Robert had grown up poor himself. Though that was a part of his life he rarely talked about. Publicly, his family had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 8 years old, and they'd struggled for years to make ends meet. His father had worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, and his mother had cleaned office buildings at night. While studying English during the day, he remembered what it felt like to be looked down on because of his circumstances. He remembered the shame of wearing second-hand clothes to school, of being embarrassed when classmates came over to their tiny apartment. But he also remembered the kindness of teachers and community members who had seen potential in him and helped him succeed despite the odds. That experience had shaped everything about who Robert had become. Even after building his technology company into a multi-billion-dollar empire, he never forgot where he came from. His charitable foundation focused specifically on helping people who were facing the same kinds of struggles his family had once endured. So, when he saw Derek treating this woman with such disrespect, it triggered something deep inside him. This wasn't just about one homeless person being mistreated. It was about the fundamental question of how society treats its most vulnerable members. As Derek's voice grew louder and more condescending, Robert felt his own anger rising. He could see that several customers were uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but nobody seemed willing to intervene. The homeless woman, Margaret, he heard her say her name was handling the situation with remarkable dignity. But Robert could see the pain in her eyes. When Derek made his comment about Margaret's appearance not being appropriate for the store, Robert had heard enough. He had been in boardrooms with some of the most powerful people in the world, and he knew that true class had nothing to do with money or clothes. It was about how you treated other people, especially those who couldn't do anything for you. In return, Robert began walking toward the confrontation, his mind already working through how to handle the situation. He wasn't the type of person who enjoyed using his wealth and influence to intimidate others. But sometimes it was necessary to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. As he got closer, he could hear more of the conversation. Derek was calling for security and making it clear that he wanted Margaret removed from the store immediately. The crowd was becoming more agitated, with several people openly expressing their disapproval of Derek's behavior. Robert studied Derek's body, language, and tone. This was a man who was used to having authority over others. Someone who probably felt powerful when he could control situations and make decisions that affected people's lives. But Robert could also see that Derek was feeling pressured and defensive, which meant he was likely to make even worse choices if the situation continued to escalate. The homeless woman. Margaret was still trying to leave peacefully. She had gathered her belongings and was attempting to walk toward the exit with as much dignity as she could maintain. But Derek wasn't satisfied with just having her leave. He seemed determined to make an example of her, to ensure that everyone understood he was in charge. Robert thought about his daughter, who would be celebrating her birthday tomorrow. He had taught her that true success in life wasn't measured by money or status, but by how much good you could do for others. He wondered what she would think if she saw him walk away from this situation without trying to help. He also thought about his own employees and the culture he had tried to create in his companies. He had always insisted that everyone, from the CEO to the newest intern, should be treated with respect and dignity. How could he expect that from his own organization if he wasn't willing to stand up for those same principles in his daily life? As Robert got within earshot of the confrontation, he could see that Margaret was trembling slightly, whether from fear, embarrassment, or anger. He couldn't tell. But it was clear that this public humiliation was taking a toll on her. No matter how strong she was trying to appear, Derek was still ranting about store policies and appropriate behavior, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his own behavior was far more inappropriate than anything Margaret had done. Several customers had pulled out their phones and were recording the incident, which Robert knew could create serious problems for the store if the video went viral. Robert took a deep breath and stepped forward. He had learned long ago that the most effective way to handle a situation like this wasn't to come in shouting or making threats. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply treat someone with the respect and kindness they deserved, especially when others were refusing to do the same. He was about to change the entire dynamic of what was happening, though Derek had no idea what was coming his way. "Excuse me," Robert said calmly, his voice cutting through Derek's angry tirade like a gentle breeze. The simple words carried an authority that made everyone in the area turn to look at him. Derek spun around, clearly irritated at yet another interruption to his attempt to restore order. He saw a middle-aged Asian man in a simple gray suit. Nothing particularly flashy or expensive-looking about him.
Ow.
The man appeared calm and composed. But Derek was too worked up to pay attention to details like the quality of the stranger's watch, or the confident way he carried himself. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," Derek snapped, his frustration now spilling over onto this new person who dared to interfere with his authority. "I'm dealing with a situation here involving a trespasser, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me handle store business." Robert didn't respond to Derek's rudeness. Instead, he walked directly toward Margaret, who was still standing near the piano with her worn canvas bag clutched to her chest. Her eyes were downcast, and she looked like she wanted nothing more than to disappear from this humiliating situation. "Ma'am," Robert said gently, extending his hand toward her with the same respect he would show to any distinguished guest. "Was absolutely beautiful. I haven't heard Chopin played with such emotion in years." Margaret looked up in surprise, her eyes meeting Robert's kind gaze. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether this was another person who was about to judge her harshly. But something in his expression told her this was different. This man was actually talking to her like she was a human being worthy of respect. "You," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I I used to teach piano a long time ago. Where did you study? Robert asked, genuinely interested in her answer. He could tell from her playing that she had received formal training. It's probably at a high level. The crowd around them had grown quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. People were watching this unexpected interaction with curiosity rather than the uncomfortable tension from before. Even Derek seemed momentarily thrown off by the stranger's calm demeanor, an obvious respect for Margaret. I went to the Eastman School of Music, Margaret replied, a hint of pride creeping back into her voice. I got my master's degree there. In 1987, then I taught elementary school music for 30 years before. Her voice trailed off. The painful memories too fresh to share with a stranger. Robert's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise and respect. Eastman was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Getting accepted there required exceptional talent, and earning a master's degree meant years of intensive study. This woman wasn't just someone who could play a few songs. She was a professionally trained musician. Eastman, Robert repeated, nodding appreciatively. That's incredibly impressive. Professor Williams still teaching composition there? Margaret's face lit up for the first time since the confrontation. Begin? You know Professor Williams? He was still there when I visited a few years ago. He was my advisor for my thesis on using classical music in elementary education. Derek watched this exchange with growing confusion and annoyance. He didn't understand why this stranger was having a friendly conversation with a homeless woman, and he certainly didn't like the way it was making him look in front of all these customers. He needed to regain control of the situation. Sir, I don't know who you are, but this woman needs to leave the store immediately, Derek interrupted, his voice getting louder again. She's been trespassing and using our property without permission. I don't care if she went to music school or not. She doesn't belong here. Robert turned to look at Derek for the first time since approaching Margaret. His expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Derek take an unconscious step backward. I'm sorry. I should have introduced myself, Robert said. His tone still polite, but with an undertone that suggested Derek should pay attention. My name is Robert Chen. The name hit Derek like a physical blow. His face went completely white, and his mouth fell open in shock. Everyone in the city knew that name. Chen Technologies was one of the largest employers in the area, and Robert Chen was regularly featured in the business section of the local newspaper. His company's headquarters building dominated the downtown skyline, and his charitable foundation had donated millions to local schools and hospitals. Mr. Chen, Derek stammered, his aggressive tone disappearing instantly. I had no idea you were...
Me. I didn't recognize. ...
He was frantically trying to think of a way to salvage the situation, but the damage was already done. Too many people had witnessed his behavior, and now one of the most powerful men in the city had seen it too. Please don't let me interrupt, Robert said, turning his attention back to Margaret while completely ignoring Derek's obvious panic. You were telling me about your teaching career. What age groups did you work with? Margaret seemed bewildered by the sudden change in dynamics, but she answered his question. Mostly elementary. Grades K through 5. I loved working with the younger kids because they were so excited about everything. They didn't have any preconceptions about what music should be. They just felt it. That's wonderful, Robert said, and his interest was clearly genuine. Music education is so important for children's development. Did you ever work with kids from disadvantaged backgrounds? Oh yes, Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger as she talked about something she was passionate about. Actually, that was my specialty. I spent most of my career in titleized schools, working with kids whose families couldn't afford private music lessons. Some of those children had incredible natural talent that might never have been discovered otherwise. Derek stood nearby, sweating despite the store's air conditioning. He could see several customers recording this conversation with their phones, and he knew that his earlier behavior was probably being captured too. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to his career. Mr. Chen, Derek tried to interject. Perhaps we could step aside and discuss this situation privately. I'm sure we can work something out that would be satisfactory to everyone. Robert glanced at Derek with a look that made it clear he found the manager's sudden change in attitude distasteful. I think this conversation is fine right here. Margaret was just telling me about her work with children. Use of Margaret's name, spoken with such respect, seemed to give her confidence. She straightened her shoulders and continued talking about her former students and the joy of watching them discover their musical abilities as they talked. Robert was putting together the pieces of Margaret's story. He could see that this was someone who had dedicated her life to helping others, someone who had made a real difference in countless children's lives. Whatever circumstances had led to her current situation, it was clear that she deserved better than the treatment she was receiving. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the unusual scene of one of the city's most prominent businessmen having a respectful conversation with a homeless woman, while the store manager stood by looking increasingly desperate. Robert was about to make an offer that would change Margaret's life forever, but first, he had something else he needed to address. Robert pulled out his phone and made a quick call while Derek stood frozen nearby, watching his career crumble before his eyes. Margaret listened in amazement as Robert spoke to someone about temporary housing arrangements and emergency funding. She couldn't believe this was really happening to her. "Margaret," Robert said after finishing his call, "I'd like to offer you a position with the Chen Foundation. We've been looking for someone to develop our music education program, particularly for underserved communities. Your background is exactly what we need." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of shame or sadness. These were tears of hope and disbelief. I don't understand. You don't even know me. Why would you help someone like me? Someone like you?" Robert repeated gently. "You mean someone with a master's degree from one of the best music schools in the country? Someone who spent 30 years teaching children and helping them discover their talents. Margaret, you're exactly the kind of person who makes the world better." The crowd around them had grown to nearly 40 people now. Word was spreading throughout the store that something incredible was happening in the furniture section. Several employees had left their posts to witness the scene, and even customers from other parts of the mall were wandering over to see what the commotion was about. Derek tried one more desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I was simply trying to enforce store policy. I had no idea about this woman's background, and if I had known... If you had known what?" Robert interrupted, his calm demeanor finally showing a hint of steel. "If you had known she was educated and talented, you would have treated her differently? But because you thought she was just another homeless person, it was okay to humiliate her in public?" Derek's face turned red as he realized there was no good answer to that question. Several people in the crowd murmured their agreement with Robert's point. The businessman in the expensive suit who had defended Margaret earlier stepped forward. "I recorded the whole thing," he said, holding up his phone. "The way you treated her was disgusting. She wasn't bothering anyone. She was sharing something beautiful with all of us." Other people began speaking up as well. The young mother with the stroller described how her baby had fallen asleep to Margaret's playing. The elderly man talked about how the music had reminded him of his late wife. The teenager from electronics mentioned how Margaret's performance had been the most amazing thing she'd seen all week. Derek looked around desperately for support, but found none. Even his own employees were looking at him with disappointment. He had always prided himself on running a professional establishment, but now he realized that his definition of professional had been completely wrong. While Derek was dealing with the consequences of his actions, Robert was focused entirely on Margaret. He had already called his assistant to arrange for a hotel room for the next few nights, and his foundation's emergency fund would cover her immediate expenses. But more importantly, he wanted to make sure she understood that this job offer was real. The position would involve developing curriculum for our youth music programs, Robert explained. "We work with schools, community centers, and shelters throughout the city. You'd be training other teachers, working directly with children, and helping us expand our reach to kids who need music in their lives." Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. "I haven't worked as a teacher in 3 years. I don't know if I remember how to do lesson plans and curriculum development. And look at me. I don't even have proper clothes for a job interview." "We'll figure all of that out," Robert assured her. "What matters is your heart and your knowledge. Those are things that don't change, no matter what circumstances you're facing. As for clothes and supplies, That's the easy part. My assistant will help you get everything you need." The crowd was watching this transformation with amazement. In the span of 30 minutes, they had witnessed a talented woman being treated with cruelty, then watched as one act of kindness changed everything. Many people were openly crying now, moved by the beauty of what they were seeing. Derek's phone started ringing. He looked at the caller ID and saw that it was his district manager. His stomach dropped as he realized that news of this incident was already spreading. Someone had probably posted the videos online, and corporate was getting calls about it. "I have to take this," Derek said weakly, stepping away from the crowd. But the phone call was exactly as bad as he had feared. The district manager had already seen multiple videos of the incident on social media. The company's customer service line was being flooded with complaints about Derek's behavior. While Derek dealt with his professional crisis, Margaret was experiencing the most surreal hour of her life. Robert had introduced her to his assistant over the phone. They were already making arrangements for her to start work the following Monday. The salary he mentioned was more than she had made as a school teacher, and it came with full benefits, including health insurance. "There's one more thing," Robert said, looking around at the crowd that had gathered. "This piano where you were playing, it's going to be donated to the Pine Street shelter, along with a full music program. We'll make sure that anyone who wants to learn or practice music has the opportunity to do so." The crowd burst into spontaneous applause. Several people approached Margaret to congratulate her and express how much they had enjoyed her performance. The businessman who had recorded Derek's behavior shook Robert's hand and thanked him for stepping in. The young mother told Margaret that she hoped her daughter would grow up to be as brave and talented as she was. Even some of the store employees came over to apologize for Derek's behavior and to congratulate Margaret on her new opportunity. They explained that Derek's treatment of her didn't represent the values of the company or its workers. As the excitement began to die down, Robert walked with Margaret toward the store exit. They talked about logistics, when she would start work, where she would stay tonight, and what she needed to do to prepare for her new role. Why, Margaret asked as they reached the doors. "Why did you do all this for a stranger?" Robert thought for a moment before answering. "My family came to this country with nothing," he said. "We faced discrimination and hardship, but people along the way showed us kindness when we needed it most. A teacher who believed in me, a neighbor who helped my parents find work, a guidance, a counselor who encouraged me to apply for college scholarships. None of them had to help us, but they did, and it changed everything." He paused and looked back toward the furniture section where the old piano still sat. "Everyone deserves a chance to show what they're capable of. You never lost your talent or your knowledge. You just needed someone to give you an opportunity to use them again." As they walked out together, neither of them noticed Derek packing up his office. His employment had been terminated effective immediately, and security was escorting him out of the building. The videos of his treatment of Margaret had already been viewed millions of times online, making him the poster child for everything wrong with how society treats vulnerable people. But Margaret's story was just beginning. Within a week, she would be featured in newspapers and magazines as an example of resilience and the power of second chances. Her music program would become one of the most successful initiatives in the Chen Foundation's history, helping thousands of children discover their love of music. And every day, when she arrived at her new office, Margaret would pass by a small plaque that Robert had installed near the entrance. It read, "Music has the power to transform lives. But only when we remember that every person deserves dignity, respect, and the chance to share their gifts with the world."